But inside one of these homes, a retired doctor is waiting. He is an old man now, a respected member of his community, a grandfather who enjoys the quiet of his golden years. He hears a knock at the door. When he opens it, he isn't looking at a patient or a neighbor. He is looking at a ghost. He is looking at a woman who should have been reduced to ash 48 years ago. Her name is Eva Mozes Kor. She was 10 years old when she last saw a man in his uniform. She was a Mengele Twin, a human specimen in the most notorious laboratory in human history. And she hasn't come for revenge. She has come for a confession. In the next few minutes, this woman will sit across from a former SS physician, Dr. Hans Wilhelm Münch, and she will ask him to do the unthinkable. Confirm the existence of the gas chambers. And in the heat of that conversation, after decades of living a lie, the doctor will lean in and say one thing, a single sentence, that will send shockwaves through the historical community and change the way we look at the survivors of the Holocaust forever. I'm going to show you that specific scene, the exact moment the good man of Auschwitz admitted the truth within the first half of this story. But the one thing he said that day wasn't just about the gas. It was about the soul of a perpetrator who had spent half a century trying to forget. Before we get to that reveal, we have to open a much bigger loop. How does a man who worked in the heart of a death camp get acquitted by a war crimes tribunal? How does a victim find the strength to ring the doorbell of her tormentor? And what was the secret document they signed together on the ruins of a crematorium that made the world scream traitor at a survivor? If you want to understand the limits of human evil and the terrifying power of a single word of truth, stay with me. This is the story of the hunt for Dr. Hans Münch and the confrontation that broke the final silence of the Third Reich. Before we dive into the dark science of the SS, if you believe that history should never be forgotten, especially the parts that are hard to hear, hit that subscribe button. We go deep into the archives here to bring you the stories that shaped our world. And I want to hear from you in the comments. If you were in Eva's shoes, could you sit in that living room? Could you breathe the same air as the man who watched your family walk to their deaths? Let's get into the rewind. To understand the 1993 confrontation, you have to understand the day the clock stopped for Eva Mozes. It was May 1944. A cattle car door slid open, and the Hungarian sun hit the eyes of a 10-year-old girl. The smell hit her first, a thick, sweet, heavy stench that she didn't realize was the smell of burning flesh. This was the ramp. Families were being pushed, screamed at, and sorted. Amidst the chaos, an SS guard was scanning the crowd, not for strength, but for symmetry. He saw Eva and her sister Miriam. He saw their identical faces. He shouted, "Twins! Twins!" Eva's mother grabbed them tight. She didn't know that in this hellscape, being a twin was the only thing that would save them from the gas that night, but it would also condemn them to something far more intimate and terrifying. To reach that depth, a script needs to slow down and analyze every psychological beat, historical nuance, and the logistical how-to of the hunt and the encounter. We need to expand on the life of Eva and Miriam before the war, the specific scientific climate of the SS Hygiene Institute, the details of the 1947 trial, and the agonizing journey of the 1993 meeting. But inside one of these homes, a retired doctor is waiting. He is an old man now, a respected member of his community, a grandfather who enjoys the quiet of his golden years. He hears a knock at the door. When he opens it, he isn't looking at a patient or a neighbor. He is looking at a ghost. He is looking at a woman who should have been reduced to ash 48 years ago. Her name is Eva Mozes Kor. She was 10 years old when she last saw a man in his uniform. She was a Mengele Twin, a human specimen in the most notorious laboratory in human history. And she hasn't come for revenge. She has come for a confession. In the next few minutes, this woman will sit across from a former SS physician, Dr. Hans Wilhelm Münch, and she will ask him to do the unthinkable, confirm the existence of the gas chambers. And in the heat of that conversation, after decades of living a lie, the doctor will lean in and say one thing, a single sentence, that will send shockwaves through the historical community and change the way we look at the survivors of the Holocaust forever. I'm going to show you that specific scene, the exact moment the good man of Auschwitz admitted the truth within the first half of this story. But the one thing he said that day wasn't just about the gas, it was about the soul of a perpetrator who had spent half a century trying to forget. Before we get to that reveal, we have to open a much bigger loop. How does a man who worked in the heart of a death camp get acquitted by a war crimes tribunal? How does a victim find the strength to ring the doorbell of her tormentor? And what was the secret document they signed together on the ruins of a crematorium that made the world scream traitor at a survivor? If you want to understand the limits of human evil and the terrifying power of a single word of truth, stay with me. This is the story of the hunt for Dr. Hans Münch and the confrontation that broke the final silence of the Third Reich. Before we dive into the dark science of the SS, if you believe that history should never be forgotten, especially the parts that are hard to hear, hit that subscribe button. We go deep into the archives here to bring you the stories that shaped our world. And I want to hear from you in the comments. If you were in Eva's shoes, could you sit in that living room? Could you breathe the same air as the man who watched your family walk to their deaths? Let's get into the rewind. To understand the 1993 confrontation, you have to understand the day the clock stopped for Eva Mozes. It was May 1944. A cattle car door slid open, and the Hungarian sun hit the eyes of a 10-year-old girl. The smell hit her first, a thick, sweet, heavy stench that she didn't realize was the smell of burning flesh. This was the ramp. Families were being pushed, screamed at, and sorted. Amidst the chaos, an SS guard was scanning the crowd, not for strength, but for symmetry. He saw Eva and her sister Miriam. He saw their identical faces. He shouted, "Twins! Twins!" Eva's mother grabbed them tight. She didn't know that, in this hellscape, being a twin was the only thing that would save them from the gas that night, but it would also condemn them to something far more intimate and terrifying. Dr. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death, had a specific obsession. He believed that if he could unlock the secrets of multiple births, he could help the Aryan race multiply faster. To him, the Mozes twins weren't children. They were biological materials. They were specimens to be measured, injected, and eventually dissected. While other children were sent to the left, to the showers that weren't showers, Eva and Miriam were sent to the right. They were taken to a special barrack. They were given a number, A7063. This number wasn't just an ID, it was a psychological branding. It was the moment Eva ceased to be a daughter and became a data point. But Mengele wasn't alone. He was part of a massive medical hierarchy. A few miles away, at a place called the Reisko Hygiene Institute, another doctor was working. His name was Hans Wilhelm Münch. He was younger, a bacteriologist by trade. He wasn't a sadist. He didn't whistle while people died. He was a scientist. He was there to study malaria, to study typhus, to protect the SS from the very diseases that were ravaging the prisoners. And here is the first major hook of this mystery. Hans Münch was the only doctor at Auschwitz who flatly refused to participate in the selections on the ramp. When his superiors told him it was his duty to decide who lived and who died, he told them it was disgusting. He said it was beneath a physician. In a system where no was a death sentence, Münch was somehow allowed to say it and keep his job. Mengele and Münch represented the two faces of the Nazi medical machine. One was obsessed with racial purity and cruel curiosities. The other was focused on practical military science. But they both wore the same skull and crossbones on their hats. They both ate in the same mess hall. They both knew exactly what was happening in the chimneys that never stopped smoking. Eva survived Mengele's 2-week death sentence. She survived injections that caused her limbs to swell until she couldn't move. She survived by crawling across the dirty floor to find water while the guards weren't looking. She survived the liberation in January 1945. But when the war ended, the world entered a new phase, the hunt for justice. In 1947, Hans Münch stood in a dock in Poland. He was surrounded by 40 other SS members. The prosecutors were calling for gallows for everyone. But then, something strange happened. Prisoner after prisoner, people who had worked as slave laborers in his lab, stood up and spoke for him. They said he had fed them. They said he had protected them. They said he was a human being. Because of that testimony, Hans Münch was the only person acquitted. He walked out of that courtroom a free man. He went back to Germany. He became a country doctor. He lived a life of peace and respect. Meanwhile, Eva was living in a nightmare that wouldn't end. She had the physical scars, the missing family, and the unanswered questions. For 48 years, these two lives moved in parallel. The doctor lived in the good man narrative. The survivor lived in the victim narrative. But in 1993, those two paths were about to collide in a living room in the mountains, and the collision would force a truth out into the open that neither of them was prepared for. By the time the 1990s rolled around, the world was beginning to feel like a very different place for Eva. She had built a life in Terre Haute, Indiana, but the silence of the past was becoming deafening. At the same time, a disturbing trend was rising: Holocaust denial. People were beginning to claim that the gas chambers were a technical impossibility, a fabrication of war propaganda. This wasn't just an academic debate for Eva. It was a second assault on her identity. She realized that if the survivors died without a confession from the other side, the truth might die with them. She didn't just need a survivor's testimony, she needed a perpetrator's confirmation. She began a journey that many of her peers found horrifying. She decided to track down any living Nazi doctor who had been at Auschwitz. Most had vanished or died, but one name kept appearing in the files of the 1947 Krakow trials: Hans Wilhelm Münch. The search wasn't easy. In an era before the instant connectivity of the modern web, tracking a retired doctor in rural Germany required painstaking archival work and international phone calls. Eva eventually found a lead through an investigative journalist. The good man of Auschwitz wasn't hiding. He was living under his own name in a peaceful Bavarian village. When Eva finally secured his address, her heart hammered against her ribs. She was a woman who had been experimented on by men who looked exactly like him. She was walking back into the lion's den. She traveled to Germany in 1993, accompanied by her son, Alex. As they drove through the winding roads of the German countryside, the beauty of the landscape felt like an insult to the memory of the mud and blood of Birkenau. She arrived at his door. She didn't call ahead to give him a chance to run or prepare legal defense. She simply knocked. When the door opened, she saw a man in his 80s. He looked like any other grandfather. He was wearing a cardigan, not a uniform, but Eva looked at his eyes and saw the person who had been present while the smoke of her family rose into the Polish sky. To her surprise, Münch invited her in. He didn't slam the door. He didn't call the police. They sat in his living room, a space filled with books, lace doilies, and the smell of stale coffee. It was the most surreal moment of her life. Here was the specimen and the scientist, 50 years later, sitting on the same floral-patterned sofa. Eva was blunt. She didn't start with small talk. She asked him about the experiments. She asked him about Mengele. Münch began to speak, and as he did, the good man narrative began to show its cracks. He admitted that he had been a part of the system. He admitted that he had seen things that no human should ever see. But then, Eva pushed him on the one thing that the deniers were using as a weapon, the gas chambers. She asked him point blank, "Did you see the gas chambers? Do you know for a fact how they worked?" Münch didn't flinch. He looked at her and confirmed that his role as a doctor required him to be present during the process. He explained that a physician had to be there to certify that the victims were dead so that the Sonderkommando could begin clearing the bodies. He described the efficiency of the Zyklon B. He described the screams that would eventually stop. But it was what he said next, the one thing that acted as the trigger for the rest of their journey, that truly shook the room. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, he looked at Eva and said, in essence, that the most terrifying part of his job wasn't the killing itself. It was the fact that they had turned murder into a routine, everyday administrative task. He told her that, for the SS doctors, the gas chambers were just a problem of hygiene. Notorious. That sentence, the idea that mass murder had been reduced to a hygiene problem, was the confirmation of the absolute banality of evil. But Eva realized this verbal confession wasn't enough. It would be his word against the deniers. She needed it in writing. She asked him if he would be willing to go back to Auschwitz with her. She asked if he would stand on the ruins of the gas chambers and sign a formal statement affirming that everything he just said was true. This was the ultimate test. For Münch, this was a massive legal risk. To sign such a document was to provide evidence that could be used against him in future trials. It was a public admission of being a witness to and a participant in a genocide. Yet, he agreed. He told her that he had nightmares every night. He said that the good man acquittal in 1947 had cleared his record, but it hadn't cleared his conscience. 2 years later, in the dead of winter, they stood together at the ruins of Crematorium II in Birkenau. The ground was frozen, much like it had been when Eva was a child. The wind was howling through the remains of the brick chimneys. Münch was visibly trembling. He wasn't the tall, imposing SS officer anymore. He was a frail old man facing the physical evidence of his past. Eva produced the document. It was a simple, clear affirmation. He took the pen. As he signed his name, Dr. Hans Wilhelm Münch, he wasn't just signing a piece of paper. He was signing the death warrant of Holocaust denial. He was providing the world with an inside witness who could never be debunked. But as the ink dried on the page, Eva felt a different kind of pressure building. She looked at the man who had helped run this factory of death, and she realized that she was about to do something that would make her the most controversial survivor in history. She wasn't just going to accept his signature, she was going to give him something in return. Something that many would call a betrayal of the 6 million. She prepared to tell him her one thing. A secret she had been harboring since that first meeting in the Bavarian living room. A secret that would change the definition of justice forever. As they stood there in the bitter Polish cold, next to the collapsed remains of the gas chambers, the air felt thick with the presence of ghosts. For Dr. Münch, the signing of the document was a technical surrender to the truth. But for Eva, it was a moment of profound, almost terrifying clarity. She looked at this man who had once been a part of the machine that erased her family, and she realized that despite his confession, despite his document, he still held a piece of her soul captive. She was still a victim as long as he was her tormentor. She pulled out a second letter. This one wasn't for the archives or the historians. It was a personal letter addressed to Dr. Hans Münch. She began to read it aloud, her voice steady against the howling wind. She told him that she, a survivor of the Mengele experiments, was granting him her personal forgiveness. The reaction from Münch was not what you might expect. He didn't break down in tears or drop to his knees. Instead, he stood there with a look of stunned and almost clinical disbelief. He looked at her as if she were a biological miracle, a specimen that had developed a trait he couldn't explain through bacteriology or genetics. In that silence, he whispered a line that Eva would carry for the rest of her life. He told her, in essence, that her forgiveness was the only thing that could make the nightmares stop, but he admitted that he didn't think it was possible for a human to do what she was doing. But while that moment felt like a private bridge between two souls, the world outside was preparing to tear it down. The news that a victim had forgiven a Nazi doctor on the very ground of Birkenau sparked a global firestorm. Other survivors, including some of the Mengele twins who had suffered alongside Eva, were outraged. They argued that she had no right to forgive on behalf of the dead. They accused her of cleansing a Nazi's record. This is where we have to pause and look at the hunt that led to this moment. Eva's journey to find Münch wasn't just a physical search for an address. It was a psychological hunt for a way to kill the victim inside herself. She spent years researching the 1947 Krakow trials, obsessed with the fact that Münch was the only one acquitted. She wanted to know why. Was he truly good? Or was he just better at hiding his crimes? She discovered that during the 1947 trial, prisoners testified that Münch would purposefully delay experiments. He would tell his superiors that he needed more time to study a specific blood sample, knowing that as long as the prisoner was under his care, they wouldn't be sent to the gas chambers. He was a man playing a high-stakes game of chess with death, using the bureaucracy of the SS against itself. Yet even a good man in the SS was still a man who woke up every morning, put on the uniform, and walked past the chimneys. He was a man who knew the schedule of the trains. He was a man who socialized with Mengele. Eva's hunt revealed the grayest areas of human morality, that a person can be a savior to 10 people while being a silent witness to the murder of 10,000. The confrontation in the Bavarian living room in 1993 had been the first time Münch had been forced to drop the scientific mask. When Eva first asked him about the gassings, he initially tried to explain it through the lens of military necessity and orders. But Eva wouldn't let him. She kept bringing him back to the children. She kept bringing him back to the zoo. It was during that first encounter that she saw the true toll of his silence. Münch told her that for 50 years he had been living in a house built of lies. He had been a hero to his patients in Germany, but every time he saw a twin or a child with hollow eyes, he was back in Poland. He told her that the acquittal in 1947 had spared his life, but it had trapped him in a perpetual state of unjudged guilt. By the time they reached the signing in 1995, the stakes had grown. Eva wanted to use his signature to strike a blow against the growing movement of historical revisionists. These were people who claimed that the gas chambers were just morgues or bomb shelters. Münch's signature, from a man who was there, who was SS, who was acquitted, was a bullet through the heart of those lies. But as the world debated her forgiveness, Eva stood her ground. She explained that for decades she had felt like a small, powerless child whenever she thought of the camp. By forgiving Münch, she was effectively saying, I have the power to decide how this story ends. Not you, not Mengele, not the SS. She was no longer waiting for a doctor to decide if she had 2 weeks to live. She was deciding if the doctor had the right to be at peace. However, the one thing Münch said that day was only half of the reveal. There was a darker, more chilling postscript to their encounter that many people forget. As the years went on and Münch began to age, his mind started to fail. And in that failure, the good man mask didn't just crack, it shattered. As the sun began to dip below the horizon at the Birkenau Memorial, the gravity of what had just occurred began to sink in. Dr. Münch had signed the document, and Eva had offered her forgiveness. On the surface, it was a moment of peak human reconciliation. But the aftermath of this meeting reveals a much darker, more complex reality about the Nazi mind and the persistence of indoctrination. Years after that 1995 meeting, a German filmmaker tracked down Dr. Münch for a final interview. By this time, the doctor was suffering from the early stages of Alzheimer's. In the world of psychology, there's a phenomenon where the social mask, the layer of personality we build to fit into polite society, is the first thing to dissolve as the brain ages. What remains is the raw, unfiltered core of a person's youngest and deepest convictions. In that interview, the good man of Auschwitz began to disappear. Under the pressure of the journalist's questions, Münch began to speak as if he were still wearing the SS uniform. He didn't just recall the camp, he began to justify it again. He spoke about the biological necessity of eliminating certain groups. He spoke about the prisoners not as people he had saved, but as material that was unfortunately defective. This is the chilling one thing that history often hides. The ideology that fueled the Holocaust wasn't just a political phase. For many of these doctors, it was a fundamental rewiring of their morality. Even after Eva's monumental act of forgiveness, the poison of the 1940s was still dormant in Münch's mind, waiting for his cognitive defenses to drop so it could resurface. It suggested that while Eva had freed herself, the doctor was still, in some deep, dark way, a prisoner of the Reich. This revelation makes Eva's choice even more radical. She didn't forgive him because he was a reformed man. She forgave him despite the fact that he might still hold those views. She realized that the hunt for the perfect, repentant Nazi was a fool's errand. If she waited for them to be worthy of forgiveness, she would be waiting in a prison of bitterness for the rest of her life. The document Münch signed, however, remains an immovable fact of history. It stands in the archives as a rare instance where the blueprints of hell were confirmed by one of the architects. Eva took that document back to the United States, using it as a shield against the rising tide of historical revisionism. She proved that the best way to fight a lie isn't just with a victim's cry, but with a perpetrator's signature. So we return to the central question of this encounter. Was the one thing, he said, his admission of the routine, a hygienic nature of the gassings, a sign of his guilt or a sign of his detachment? And was Eva's forgiveness a gift to him, or a weapon used to finally destroy his power over her? Today, the story of Eva Mozes Kor and Dr. Hans Münch is taught in ethics classes around the world. It serves as a reminder that the war for the truth never really ends. It continues every time someone tries to erase the past, and every time a survivor finds the strength to stand up and say, "I was there, and so were you." As we close this chapter, I want to leave you with a thought. Eva Mozes Kor passed away in 2019 on a trip to, of all places, Krakow, Poland, near the very camp where her life was changed forever. She died a free woman. She didn't die a victim of Mengele. She died a teacher of power. If you were standing where she stood, looking into the eyes of a man who represented your worst nightmares, what would be the one thing you would need to hear to let go? Or some evil so profound that letting go is an insult to the dead? The debate continues in the comments below. If you believe these stories of human resilience need to be told, please share this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the shadows of history. Thank you for watching and for remembering. I'll see you in the next one.